Today we're going to look at CSS functions. Our starter code is much like the ending code for the last lesson. However, let's quickly look at the HTML, and as you can see our page over here on the right, I have added an H2 heading, a paragraph, and then a link inside of a section element that is inside of the main element. And I have commented out the divs we previously had in the last lesson, but we will come back to those, so I wanted to leave those in. Our CSS remains the same from the last lesson, and we can look at some functions we have already used in previous lessons. If we just scroll down, there are color functions, and we can see here inside of our prefers color scheme, this is one change I've already made because I wanted the light theme to show up. But if you remember, if we put dark here, I need lowercase or prefer lowercase. If I save, I get dark mode because my system preferences are for dark mode. But you can switch this to light, and then this dark mode will not apply. So let's look at this. We've got RGB, which is a function. And if I were to click here inside the color for VS Code, and then we click the bar at the top, as we've learned about colors, we can see other values. And HSL, it has parentheses as well, and a value or values inside. That's also a function. HWB is a function. So these are color functions, and that's what you see here. We've also used image functions, and if I scroll down just a little further and we get to the body or the main element, we should have something. Yep, there in the body, we've got a radial gradient function. And as we've learned in the past, we can also use linear gradient, but those are functions. They have the term radial gradient or linear gradient, and then parentheses, and then something is passed inside, some value. And then as we see here, we're also using a reference function, which is var. And we learned about var just in the previous lesson as we're using CSS variables. So we use var and put the variable inside to get the value from that variable. Another reference function we learned in the past when we were working with images was URL with parentheses. And that's how we loaded images into a background image spot. And there are many useful CSS functions, so many that I can't cover them all, but I will put a link in the description and the resources to the MDN page that does list all of the CSS functions. Today I want to cover some that I think you will use often or frequently, and a few of those are math functions, and we've used some of those too, but I want to dive just a little bit deeper. So let's scroll back up to where we have defined our font size. Right now it's currently 1.5 rem, which 1 rem would be 16 pixels, so 1.5 is currently 24 pixels. If we were to select our paragraph here and look at what was applied inside of DevTools, we would be able to see that. But now let's talk about the min function first. So instead of 1.5, we can type min, and then let's put something like 2.25 rem, and then we'll put 3 VH, which is viewport units, but it's also specifically referencing the height, not the width. And that is very useful when you're working with fonts. Now let's talk about what this min function does. It's always going to select the smallest of the two available. And notice one of these is an absolute value. So it wouldn't make sense to put in 2.75 rem or something like that here for the second value, because it would then always select the smallest. So we've put in one absolute value and one value that will change based on the height of the page. So let's save this, and then we don't see a whole lot changing here right now, but we will when we look at the height of the page. So I will bring this over to take up the full page, and then let's inspect to open the DevTools. You could also do Control-Shift and the letter I, whichever you prefer. Then I'm going to choose the Computed tab here inside of DevTools, and we'll scroll till we see the font size, and that should be coming up here shortly. There it is, 36 pixels. So that is 2.5 rem, which we set as one of the values. And remember, it will always choose the smallest of the two. The second value was 3 viewport units of height. So if we start to shrink the page, Well, notice our font is shrinking. Now let's look at the font size again, and I'll have to scroll, but it's 28.632. And you can always tell it's being calculated when you get a decimal afterwards, because we're not usually going to enter that in ourselves. So the font size is changing. Now the 3 viewport units of height are smaller than the 2.5 rem, so it's choosing that instead. But then what we should consider is the absolute value is actually a maximum. It will never get larger than that 2.5 rem. So if we scroll back, at some point it should stop growing, and we noticed it stopped growing now. If we come back to 2.5 rem, we have 36 pixels. And I said 2.5 rem. I believe this is actually 2.25 rem, which would be 2 rem would be 32 pixels, and then 0.25 would be another 4 for 36. Let's look back at our code. When I close DevTools, pull this over, and we can verify. Yes, 2.25 rem, and then 3 viewport units of height. I'm going to quickly scroll down to the main element because having this centered is just bothering me a little bit. So I'll scroll down and make some changes here. So we won't keep what we have right here. Let's comment all of this out that we were using previously in the last lesson with those divs. And now instead, let's say display flex, and then we'll say flex flow, and we'll make it a column and say no wrap. And then justify content, and there we'll say flex dash start. And we can save, and now it is all pulled up towards the top. Let's pull in some padding though, but not the 10 pixels that we had here. Let's pull in our padding variable. I can put the comment after that. So for that, we'll say var, and then dash dash padding, and save that. Now let's go ahead and remove the padding from our nav because it has a little extra padding compared to the header and footer. And then let's change the value of the padding just a little bit. As I scroll back up to the top, let's look for that padding variable. We see 0.5 rem. So let's make this EMs, and then it's based on the font size of the element it is applied to. So if we save, don't notice much of a difference, but that's what I would prefer to do for that padding. Okay, as I scroll back up, we've looked at min, and we've decided or learned that it will select the smallest of the 2 values it's given. It doesn't really matter which order you provide these values, but because of that, there are some things to consider when we provide the values. One, you should only provide one absolute value, or you know which one it will always choose. So the other one should be relative. And it's better to choose viewport height units for fonts than it is viewport width. So we're keeping a certain size in there, and you can play around with it, but I think you'll see why I lean towards choosing viewport height units. And I don't put a percentage here because really that percentage is really easy to just kind of equal what the rem is as well. So 100% would be 16 rem, which would be, I mean, not 16 rem, 16 pixels, which would be 1 rem. So 2 rems would be 200%. So this would be the equivalent of 225%. So I choose to put in the viewport height units as my relative unit when I'm applying this to font. Now you can use this min function for images and other things, and I believe we did that just a little bit in the past, but I wanted to explain more about that. So now let's move on to the max function, which is essentially the opposite of the min function. So max is always going to choose the larger of the 2 values we provide. So just so we can better see it change, I'm going to switch this from 2.25 to 1.75. Now it's always going to choose whichever is larger, either 3 viewport height units or 1.75 rem. So let's once again take a look at our page, and I'll open up the DevTools once again as well, go over to the computed side, and now I'm going to inspect this specific element so we can see that the font size is currently 37.68. So that's fairly large, but it's based on the height. Will it shrink if I bring this down? Yes, it's instantly shrinking. Now it's down to 34.56, but at some point it will stop shrinking as well. And now it has, and as we look, that's 28 pixels, which I put 1.75 rem, if I remember correctly. So that would be 16 would be 1 rem, and 0.75 would be 12, and that gives us 28 pixels. So now we see the opposite in effect, and it continues to grow as the page gets taller, but at some point it stops shrinking, and that's what we have there for the 28 pixels. Okay, so let's close this and go back and look at our max once again. Now the same applies here. You should have one absolute value, and then you should have a value that is relative, that adjusts itself, and the viewport height units, again, for font makes total sense to do that. So just like with min, the absolute value we provided was the largest it would ever get. Well, now the absolute value that we provide inside of max is the smallest it will ever get. And I know that is like contrary to what they're named. So remember, max actually provides a minimum absolute value, and min actually provides a maximum absolute value. So which of these would I use? Well, actually, I won't use either one of these. There is a third function we can use, and it is called clamp. And it's a newer function. It hasn't been around as long, but it has good support now. And there we can provide a minimum, so I'm going to say 1.75, just like we used in our max. And then we put in the ideal size, which I'll put in our relative units of viewport height of 3 units. And then we can put in a maximum. So I'll put in our 2.25 that we used inside of our min function. So this lets us provide both. We had a maximum inside of the min function, and that's right here. And then we had a minimum that was inside of the max function, and I've got it right here. And then we always use the viewport height units of 3 for that relative, and it's in between. So you've got minimum, ideal, and maximum. So now if we save and bring this back once again, we should see some changes, but it will stop growing and stop shrinking at different points. Okay, so we're on the paragraph. We'll inspect that specifically, go to the computed tab, and now we'll look at the font size. Is currently 35.376. So that is somewhere in between. Now we can shrink this down, and we're noticing the font size is shrinking, but it stops shrinking now at 28 pixels. Now we can bring this back up, and I believe we said 2.25, so 36 pixels would be the largest it would get, and we achieved that now. So if we scroll back down, there it starts to shrink. So clamp works with both the minimum and maximum, and we'll choose an ideal size in between when necessary. Let's close DevTools again and bring the browser back over to the right. And now let's go ahead and apply clamp to one more variable that we can create here. And I'm going to create a font size -SM for small. And here I'll change this to 1.25, and then instead of 3, I'll use 2 viewport units, and then instead of 2.25, I'm going to make this 1, well there I've still got the 2, 1.5 rem for the maximum, and save. So now we have a small size as well. Now let's add just a little more content to see how this can apply. So I'm scrolling back down to the main area, and we'll take our padding that we have inside the main. I'm going to cut that out with Control X, and underneath main I'm going to style that section that we have. So I want lowercase though, main section. Inside the section I'm going to say flex-grow, set that to 1, and then I'll put in our padding, and then we're going to add an aside variable underneath that section. I said variable, a aside element underneath that section element in our HTML. So I'm going to say main aside, and now let's go ahead and style this. We'll choose a background-color, and I've got a color picked out, and we'll use this HSLA function. Here I'll say 0, 0%, 20%, and remember the last one is the opacity, which is the transparency. Say 0.8. And then we have a color that we'll use, and this will be for the font, and we'll just use our light color variable that we've already constructed. Then we'll use our font size, and here we'll say VR, and then our var -FS-SM for that small size we just created. Let's make this font italic so we can really tell the difference. And then the padding will once again be that padding variable we created. There it is. And save. Now we also want to provide a media query, and this will help adjust our aside, because when the screen gets too small, we should stack them. So underneath all of our current CSS, let's go ahead and add @media screen, and then we'll say min-width, and we'll choose our small breakpoint that we had in previous lessons of 576 pixels. And now for the main here, we'll say flex-flow, and we'll switch it to row, no wrap. So now they'll be side by side. And we'll say justify content, space between. Okay, after we've styled that main element, let's go ahead and add the main section here. And now we'll adjust the width of the section, and we'll use another CSS function to do that. And that is calc. And for calc, we'll say 70%, and you can mix different units. So we're mixing a percent and a pixel. And then after that, we'll go ahead and provide a width for the aside as well. So we'll say main aside, and here we'll say width. We'll use calc once again, and we'll say 30% minus 5 pixels. So what we have here is actually 10 pixels that will be between the section and the aside on larger screens. Anything larger than 500 or as large as 576 pixels or greater. I'm going to jump over to the HTML and scroll down here, and this will be in the starter code as well, or at least the finished code, but I'm going to paste in this aside here. So it also has an H2 and a paragraph, and that's it. So we save, and now we can see the column over here on the right, because we are larger than 576, or we are at least 576 pixels wide. So we have our section and our aside, and we can see that font. Let's see how they both resize now as we've applied the two different font sizes. So I will inspect, open up DevTools. I want to go to Computed, and I'm on the section, or we could choose the aside, either one, and see how those font sizes apply. So I'll look at the content here, and now they look fairly small because we're at 50% inside of DevTools just to get it all to fit. But let's go ahead and start to shrink, and notice the text shrinks for both, but then it eventually stops for both as well. So we've reached that minimum, and now it starts to grow in the main, and now it's growing in the aside, and at some point they both stop growing as well. So clamp is working well for both of those. And again, remember, if this looks a little small, it's because we're at a 50% here when we have DevTools open. So I'll close that. Now we see the full page, and now I'll drag it back over to the right. Let's go back to our CSS. Those paragraphs that we have are both content. So just underneath the aside, I'm going to put in a content class, and that's what we've applied to those paragraphs. Let's just say margin top of 20 pixels and see how that looks. Yeah, that gives a little space from the heading down to where the rest of the content starts. I like that just a little better. Okay, now what about this Google link here? Let's talk about that. So just underneath the footer, we'll go ahead and style this. And as we learned in our pseudo lesson, we can choose any link, and that should apply to both the non-visited and visited links. So let's color this fire brick. That will look a little better on the colors that we have. But after that, let's go ahead and look at the hover and the focus. So we'll say anchor hover, comma, and then we'll also have anchor focus. And then inside of those, we'll apply a filter. And there are filter functions. So in the past, actually, before we do that, let's look at what we were doing in the past. We were choosing a color, maybe HSLA, and putting that transparency in there. Or we could just leave it the color it is and just put in opacity, and maybe we'd put that to 0.8. And then when we mouse over, it just gets a little fainter. You can't tell as good with Firebrick. Maybe I'll take that down to 0.6, Yes, now it gets a little weaker when we hover over. It's a little transparent. So that's how you can do that on its own, or you can provide that fourth value inside of HSLA and choose the color as well. But what we want to do now is provide a filter, and filter has several functions. So one thing I like to do with filter is use the brightness. And here I'm going to say 150%. So instead of adding transparency, now when I mouse over, the link gets brighter. I actually really like that. I just wasn't able to do it earlier in the lessons. So I frequently do that for the hover focus. I like the filter brightness. Now something else you can do that is a cool effect, instead of brightness, is choose hue rotate. And you'll always get a complementary color if you say 180 degrees. So if we save that, let's see what is 180 degrees difference in the color wheel, if you think about colors, than Firebrick. And it's this kind of teal or green. I don't know if I like that one there, so some will have better luck than others, and you could play around with the degrees with that as well. Myself, I'll probably go back to brightness, so I'm just going to Control Z to undo till I'm back to that brightness, and I like how that works. Okay, one more function to work with while we're working with these paragraphs. Let's jump to the HTML again, and inside of our aside, we have this lorem text, and notice we provided a span element that is an inline element, and it's wrapping around it, and then it has a class of tooltip, and then it also has an attribute that is data-tooltip, and we can really provide custom attributes as long as they all start with data-, and then we can name it whatever we want. So we named this data-tooltip, and it says this is Latin. So now let's make a custom tooltip that will show when we hover over lorem inside of our aside over here. So we should see it right up here in the top right. Let's jump back to the CSS, and then just underneath the, well, let's do it underneath the content. There we are. So now let's put in a tooltip class, and inside this tooltip we'll say border-bottom, so this will indicate that a tooltip exists. We'll say 1 pixel dash, and let's try orange to see how that looks. If we save, we see the little dashed border under lorem that indicates there is something about that. Now we also want to give this position relative, because we will be using a position absolute when we choose where the tooltip shows up. So after we've applied those styles to the tooltip class, then we need tooltip hover pseudo class, but now we can stack a pseudo element, and this is the before pseudo element. So now we've applied the tooltip class, the hover pseudo class, and now the before pseudo element. And with that, I'm going to choose content, and here is where we can use a function. It's the attribute function, and now we just name the attribute. So this is our data-tooltip. And if I save this, we'll notice this appear when I hover over. And now it just appeared at the beginning in front of lorem. It says this is Latin lorem when I hover over. Now that's not what we want, but you can see how this works. Okay, let's go ahead and style the rest. So we'll say position absolute. Let's put the position at -20 pixels, which should put it up on top. If we save now and I mouse over, it shows at top, but now it's all scrunched and it comes down in there. So to get it to avoid wrapping on each of those words, we can say white dash space and then say no wrap. Now if we save and look, now it says this is Latin up above. Okay, from there, let's give this a background color. And now we could use our var and say dark color, there it is, which was black if I remember correctly. And after that we can give it padding, and here we could say var and give it our padding as well. So there we go. And then finally let's give it a border dash radius of 15 pixels and save. Now when we mouse over lorem, we get a This is Latin tooltip that pops up. We've learned a lot about CSS functions with these paragraphs and this layout, but now it's time to go back to grid and learn about some of the grid functions. So first I'll go to the HTML, and I'm going to select both our section and our aside element inside of the main element. I'll hold down Shift and click, and now I'll press Shift Alt and the letter A to comment that all out. And now I'm going to select the divs from the previous lesson. Once again, hold down Shift Alt and the letter A to uncomment those, and now we should have those back on the page. When we save, we should definitely see a difference, but we need to make some changes to the CSS also. Back in the CSS file, I'll need to scroll up to the main section, and we can comment out the flex flow, or display flex flow, and justify content. And now we will uncomment what we previously had here. But now we'll change some of this, and we'll actually just delete these 3 middle rows as well. Okay, we want this to be a display grid instead of display flex. After that, we're going to apply grid-template columns, and now we can use a grid function. And we used this when we learned about grid in a lesson, and that is the repeat function. So we're going to say repeat this 4 times, so that will give us 4 columns. And then we're going to use a math function that is specific to grid, and that is min-max. And here we provide a min and a max. So I'm going to provide 100 pixels for the smallest grid item that we would want, and 300 pixels for the largest. Now after that, I also want to adjust this gap. I did this in a previous tutorial as well, but 4 viewport width units are almost always going to be bigger than 15 pixels, so min's probably always going to select 15 pixels here. So I will change this to 2, and then I will also switch this to 20 pixels, and it should probably adjust now based on that. And after I save, you can see the changes on the page over here on the right, but we will resize the page and look at some more changes there as well. But the reason we're not seeing the grid adapt to the page the way I would like it to is because we still have in a size for the squares. We had in a width and height previously. So let's select both of those lines, Shift Alt and the letter A to comment those out, and save once again. And now we see the grid is filling up the entire space that is available. And I think we should probably provide just a little bit of padding inside that main element as well. So let's scroll back up to where we were, and just above here, the display grid, and below the flex grow, let's say padding, and let's provide the padding that we have already defined. And now once we save, we should see it give just a little space, and that looks better, and it should adapt to all sizes. So let's go ahead and drag this over and see how everything has applied. Now it did adapt to this size, so we see all 12 grid items, and you can see once they've reached that 300 width, then the gap here between the columns is going to get larger as the page has to adapt, but it kept whatever gap we had defined between the rows. Now as we resize, we'll see that change. So I'm once again going to right click and choose Inspect. Remember, you can also get into DevTools by choosing Control Shift and the letter I all at the same time, or pressing those all at the same time. Okay, now that we're here, I will select one item and inspect. So we've got a div square highlighted, and we can see it has a width of 300 pixels as I mouse over that, but we can also go to Computed, scroll down, and see that width as well. Now let's resize, and as we get in here to a size where they're not, the grid items themselves aren't changing right now, it's the space between the columns, but as we squeeze them in, now they're changing, and now we can see that width here is changing as well. So if we scroll down, it should be that same number. Well, it's close, 251.8 right now. And as we continue to squeeze, and it keeps scrolling on me, but as we continue to squeeze, it will go down until they are 100 pixels, and we're getting close, I think. And let's take a look now. And now we're at 105, so we're very, very close. And now the page starts to shift, as we'd have to put in a media query to get it to adapt after that, because they will no longer shrink in any way. They, at this point, when the page starts to break, essentially, is when they have stopped adjusting. So they are at 100 pixels right there. And if I bring this down, we should now see that 100 pixels. And if we bring it out, they begin to grow. So now 250 pixels a piece, all the way up to 300. Now notice our grid gap that we defined, and it stays what we defined it as until they stop growing. And after they stop growing, then they start to separate the columns because it needs to fill out the page. But as they are scrunched in, it keeps that space between the rows and the columns, because remember, the gap property is both a grid gap and a row gap value. It's a shorthand. So we can see how all of that works together. So we provided the min max, we used repeat as well, and then we used min once again on the gap property.